Oh, good. I can almost see my script. 100 years ago, Hambledon Common was still mostly heather. Then, a terrible fire set the heath ablaze from end to end. A crowd of villagers gathered along Malthouse Lane as the sparks flew. The fire was so intense that brigades from Godalming, Guildford, and London were summoned. It was said that the brigade from London arrived first, followed by that from Guildford, with the Godalming men bringing up the rear. After the fire, for a time, thickets of gorse sprang up in place of the heather. Trees had already begun to encroach, including many Turkey oaks, a highly invasive alien. Holly became rampant, especially towards the village hall, and bracken proliferated. Other fires followed, including a serious one in April 1958 that I remember. By 1990, only a few patches of heather remained, chiefly along footpaths. The lovely view from the top was obscured by trees. Bracken predominated from top to bottom. This photo was taken by my father in April 1934. On the right, we see the village shop with its smoking bread oven chimney. Yeah. The green, Hambledon Hurst, Chart Cottage. Merville Bottom and Merville Cottage, and on the extreme left, Mann's Cottage, the former blacksmith's cottage that was totally destroyed by a German bomb in October 1940. It is an amazing panorama. Today, from this viewpoint, you would see none of these things, only trees in close proximity. Things were very different before the Great War. This photo dates from 1906. The shop is recognizable, but there are far fewer trees. You can see the top of Merville Hill. The ditch in the foreground is still there, but trees have taken the place of rough pasture to the left of the picture. At this time, the common, which included the green, was grazed. Mrs. Khan, who lived at Chart Cottage, was one of several people who ran cattle on the common. They wandered at liberty, except on cricket days when they were chivied off the pitch. This photo shows cows grazing on the green with only the square fenced off. According to Bert Jeffrey, Mrs. Khan's geese helped the cricketers. They used to keep the grass short right up to the post office, and we could place fielders across the road. There was a small brickworks by the green, using clay extracted from the Hurst. 2 nearby ponds are former clay pits. A machine for puddling clay was worked by a pony, trudging endless revolutions. This was probably abandoned in the late 19th century. The site is now occupied by Kiln House and Alf Hammond's yard. In earlier times, the green was known as Brick Kiln Common. As a boy, Bert Jeffrey, who gardened at Hambledon Hurst for 50 years, worked in the bakery at the village shop. The large bread oven chimney survived into the 1930s, but has since been removed. There it is, the middle chimney. This photo probably dates from about 1913. Bert remembered when the pond was in daily use. The baker's horse was watered there every day at 1 o'clock after the morning's bread round. Everybody used the pond. The horses were brought from Lower Farm and from Malthouse Farm. That was in 1912. Another old photograph shows the view to the top of the common from the junction of Malthouse Lane with Lane End. The origins of common land go back to medieval times, and perhaps earlier. Much of the common land that survives today was manorial waste, the open, uncultivated, and unimproved lands of the manor. There is a misconception that common land is owned by nobody or by everybody. In fact, a common almost always has a single owner. A system of property rights going back to the 13th century vested the ownership of the soil of a common in the lord of the manor, subject to commoners' rights to its products. Today, some commons are still owned by lords of the manor. At Hambledon, the first known lord was Asier in the time of Edward the Confessor. But others are now owned by parish, district or county councils or other public bodies such as the National Trust. Rights of common usually went with properties rather than individuals. These were defined in the manorial court roll. The principal rights were pasture, the right to graze animals on the common; turbary, the right to cut peat or turves; estovers, the right to cut and take firewood but not whole trees; gorse, bracken, heather, etc.; piscary, the right to take fish from ponds and streams; pannage, the right to turn out pigs in the autumn to forage on acorns and beech mast; in the soil, the right to take sand, clay, etc. Not everyone in the community had these rights, and they were restricted by the number and type of animal and the time of year when they could be exercised. Care was taken that the commons were not overexploited. Those who abused their allocated rights could be reported to the manorial court and punished. Today at Hambledon, almost all these rights have become extinct, though in 1968 a right of estovers was claimed over part of the Hurst. In the Middle Ages, Hambledon Common would have been much more extensive than it is today. Throughout the country, a process of enclosure began early. The better land was fenced off, drained, and improved. This was a frequent source of conflict between commoners and landowners. In addition, over the centuries, piecemeal enclosures were made. Houses went up on roadside verges, and gardens were surreptitiously enlarged, a process that is not unknown today. The 1763 manor map, this is part of it, shows that the familiar boundaries of the common, defined by banks, were already established to the north, south, and east. The map is orientated south-north. Only to the west, in the direction of the new Turnpike Road, now the A283, is the boundary undefined. A small field marks the position of the Lane End houses. The last major enclosure was the Union Workhouse, founded in 1786 on land acquired from the Lord of the Manor on a 999-year lease. A new bank was thrown up and planted with oak trees at intervals. A right-of-way was retained through the grounds. More than 2 centuries later, after many transformations, the derelict site was acquired by Berkeley Homes and became Hambledon Park. In earlier times, commons were a source of many useful products. Bracken was cut as bedding for animals. Gorse, furze made excellent firewood, especially for bread ovens. Brooms were fashioned from birch twigs or heather. Tree clearance at Buses Common revealed signs of old peat cuttings. Sand had been quarried from Hambledon Common for centuries and clay dug from the Hurst. Chiddingfold and Hambledon were centres of a thriving medieval glass industry. There were 3 glass furnaces at Hambledon, at Blunden's Wood off Roundels Lane, Gunter's Wood and Van Copse. The glass house at Blunden's Wood has been dated to around 1330. Hambledon supplied a source of sand, the major constituent of glass, clay to construct the kilns, and timber for fuel and wood ash used as a fluxing agent. Over the centuries, huge quantities of sand must have been extracted from the common, utterly transforming its topography. It is an ex-industrial site. The sandpit, a playground for generations of children, was once much larger and deeper, with cliff-like banks, as shown in this 1871 watercolour by William J. Ferguson. Trees, gorse, grass, and heather have encroached. The Sutton Palmer painting on display in this hall shows a horse and cart returning from the sandpit with a load of orange sand and a spade sticking out the top. 8 deep gullies run in parallel to the south, southwest, and southeast of the sandpit. Their origin is a mystery, but they must have been connected with the excavation of sand. Sand was still being taken from the common without permission in the 1950s. The village hall was built in an old sandpit by the road in 1902, the site donated by the Lord and Lady of the manor. Grazing probably ceased shortly after the end of the First World War. With increased motor traffic, it became less safe to run cattle on the unfenced common. Without the cattle, it did not take long for scrub to encroach. A birch tree can grow from nothing to 10 feet in 5 years. Turkey oak are almost equally vigorous. Around 1840, the Lord of the Manor planted an avenue of turkey oaks in the Hurst. It was a terrible mistake. Turkey oaks are faster growing than English oaks, but not nearly as long-lived and inferior as timber or firewood. They produce innumerable acorns, distinguished by their hairy cups, and harbour a tiny wasp that horribly distorts the acorns of English oaks, knopper galls, rendering them sterile. Aided by jays and grey squirrels, turkey oaks infiltrated the area around the green and the slopes of Merville Hill. Bert Jeffrey reported that there was once good grazing from the cricket green to the Institute, the village hall, as seen in this painting by Joseph Powell, showing the back of the shop looking south. The picturesque sunken track to Moor Cottage looks ancient, but probably isn't. It was deepened and improved to provide access for the new house on Merville Hill, now St. Dominic's, in the 1890s. The winding drive from Malthouse Lane came later. Moor Cottage, originally 2 cottages, was approached by a track over the common and through the sandpit, which continued down to Buses Common. Eventually, the track through the sandpit fell into disuse, and Moor Cottage was accessed via Sweetwater Lane. This track was on a lower level than the present bridle path and was notoriously boggy and treacherous. A horse and cart were rumoured to have sunk irretrievably into the mire. The commons at Hambledon were too small to be of interest to the military in either World War. They housed no great camps, as at Whitley and Milford and other local heaths. But 2 lines of shallow trenches at the top of the common do suggest home guard activity. With many fewer trees, the stout defenders would have had an excellent outlook to the south and west and been able to bring down withering fire on any Nazis advancing along Van Lane. Early in the war, trucks rumbled up from the road to the sandpit collecting sand for sandbags. Near the little car park off Lane End, there are several old, knobbly rooted beech trees, apparently raised on plinths, no doubt the result of similar excavations. In October 1987, Hambledon was struck by the Great Storm. The road past the pond, Malthouse Lane and Lane End were buried under toppled trees. These were quickly cleared by volunteers with chainsaws, but the common remained a scene of devastation. Contractors were approached to deal with the fallen and maimed trees. The parish council arranged a work party. That November, smoke from 1,000 bonfires rose over the Weald. The heavy vehicles extracting timber created new paths over the common. Others fell into disuse. In 1991, coming upon a few patches of heather under the bracken, I began tentative scrub clearance and bracken spraying with a selective herbicide. I made contact with Craig Vincer, the National Trust warden at Whitley Common, who was engaged on a heathland restoration program on a far larger scale. In the summer of 1992, we were approached by the principal of St. Dominic's School about running a sewage pipe under the common from the school boundary to the road at Lane End. Until then, they had relied on a treatment plant in the school grounds, which was emptied regularly by a tanker that squeezed along the sunken track from Moor Cottage and up the narrow bridle path. I was worried that this work would damage tree roots and destroy some of the surviving heather. To mitigate this, the school agreed to supply heather cuttings raised in their greenhouse. They were the correct native heather, Calluna vulgaris, ling. At about this time, Surrey Wildlife Trust undertook a brief survey of the common as part of a larger survey of potential sites of nature conservation importance. They came to a depressing verdict: relict heathland, of little interest. I was determined to restore Hambledon Common to much more than relict heathland. June Booker, who lived on the green, had walked generations of dogs over the common. Like other older residents, she remembered a time when heather rather than bracken dominated the scene, at least in places. Luckily, she had some old colour photographs. They revealed a lost heathland. Would it ever return? This photo was taken in the 1960s. By 1990, such a large area of heather and no bracken could be found nowhere on the common. The short heather in the foreground seems to have regenerated after a fire, but a relentless tide of birch is moving up the hill. In the summer of 1993, Craig Vincer arranged for a mower to be brought over from Whitley. A swathe of bracken was cut near the bench at the top of the common. We had already felled a number of trees blocking the view towards Blackdown. In September, we rabbit fenced this and another small area and planted 1,000 heather cuttings supplied by the school. This was a strategy no experienced heathland manager would have contemplated. Many of the little plants, which we were unable to water, would surely succumb to drought. But, miraculously, it worked. The little plants did not shrivel, they flourished, and soon self-sown seedlings were springing up among them. Here is the scene 4 years later. The disturbance caused by the works the previous autumn had been entirely beneficial. Within a couple of years, patches of heather appeared along the line of the trench, and the rare woodlark nested in the enclosure. There was never any intention to restore the common to its appearance in the first decades of the last century, which would have involved the wholesale demolition of trees to the road and beyond. It is easy enough to fell trees and spray bracken. Some heather may return, but it will soon be lost again without grazing or long-term active management. Not everyone thought restoring the heath a good idea. At the start, I was criticised for felling 2 large turkey oaks below the bridle path. That particular critic recanted when, after a couple of years, bell heather burgeoned in their place. In the 1960s and early 1970s, the young Louis de Bernière, author of Notwithstanding, who grew up in Hambledon, romped in the head-high bracken, making hides and arranging trysts with girlfriends. He had never known the heather and attacked me roundly in his afterword for restoring it. In the early years, a contractor undertook the bracken spraying. Here is the same area near the top of the common a few years later. Until this time, I had been unaware of the work of the Surrey Heathland project under the vigorous leadership of Dr. Rob McGibbon. Rob came over to Hambledon in July 1994. He had not known that any heathland survived here, though the remaining areas of heather were small and isolated. He recommended further bracken spraying as a top priority, but scrub control was also very important. After spraying, removal of the accumulated bracken litter was the only way to return to heather cover. By hand, this was a long and very tiring job. I should consider the possibility of mechanical help. Once bracken litter was stripped off, ling and bell heather will regenerate if there's still a seed bank. Conditions had to be right, an acid soil with low fertility and low amounts of organic matter. Over the next few years, volunteer work parties and individuals helped me on the common. I had much help and advice from Ian Baldwin, the Waverley countryside ranger, who was always cheerful and optimistic. The Hazelmere District Conservation volunteers came many times. They particularly enjoyed felling trees, which sometimes toppled in unexpected directions, cutting them at knee or ankle height with bow saws, leaving Ian to finish the job with his chainsaw. The brush was flung on a bonfire, starting with difficulty, but soon developing into a tremendous blaze, shooting sparks high into the air. Here are the volunteers and others tacking the path of the sandpit in January 2003. In 1996, Rob's assistant, Marcus Turley, scraped 2 small areas of the common using a tractor. These were smothered in bracken. Afterwards, the bracken reappeared, and thousands of birch seedlings. While pulling these up a year or 2 later, I came upon a Neolithic scraper that Marcus's operations had brought to the surface. The bracken was sprayed, and within a few years, both areas were transformed. This is the plat above the sandpit, after Marcus's labours in April. second photo, looking down the slope this time, was taken in August. The third shows the restored heather some years later. In the same month, we rotivated another section of the common. This happened on 2 or 3 later occasions, when the surplus material was bagged and offered for sale in the village shop as heather peat, an excellent mulch for the garden. This was Guy's idea. He ran the shop at the time, but sadly the only person to purchase the bag was Guy himself. In 1998, Southern Electric planned to renew the high-voltage power line that ran from double poles at the top of the common down to a transformer near the road and out into the woodland beyond. This has long been an eyesore. I proposed that the cables should be placed underground. No doubt conscious of the damage trees had inflicted on this line in recent memory, Southern Electric agreed on condition we paid the £2,000 cost of digging the trench. Again, these operations stimulated a burgeoning of heather, but also of birch and gorse. Help was on hand in the form of a selected weed killer called crenite, which was guaranteed to kill birch without damaging heather. It was very expensive. However, the Heath project obtained a couple of 5-litre containers, and I set to work with a sprayer. The birch duly succumbed, but so did the heather. Indeed, it zapped everything apart from little willows. Later, crenite was banned by the European Union. Over the years, further areas were scraped by Mr. Barney, the contractor who undertook almost all the major tree work on the common. These were highly successful operations in that heather always returned in place of bracken, but the birch invasion had to be tackled by hand. Here, Hambledon and Chiddingfold dog walkers set to work. This photo shows the Hazelmere volunteers birch pulling below another area we had temporarily fenced against rabbits. On one memorable occasion, I was present while Mr. Barney was at work. He had made several runs with a small digger when I spotted an object in the freshly scraped ground. It was an intact Mesolithic hand axe, dating from perhaps 5,000 years BC, thrown up with the spoil from one of the gullies dug a millennia later by people quarrying for sand. In the year 2000, with the aid of a grant, we tackled Stone Pit Hill above Moor Cottage. This had long been a wilderness of bracken and scrub. This old postcard probably predates the First World War. Moor Cottage has yet to acquire its extension or its Tudor garage. Some major trees toppled in the Great Storm. Their removal stimulated fresh thickets of birch. This photo shows the area in autumn 1999. Moor Cottage is hidden behind trees at the bottom. The foreground bracken has long since stifled any heather. A low-slung telephone wire runs across the scene. Here's the view up the hill. Mr. Barney set to work felling trees, and in April, contractors scraped off the bracken mulch with a large machine. A dumper truck on caterpillar tracks deposited the spoil in great heaps at the edges of the site. Panic set in among the contractors when they disturbed 4 or 5 adders. They were probably grass snakes. The contractors returned to spray the bracken in July. In a very few years, the heather was restored. After the usual and continuing struggle with invading birch, gorse and brambles, Buss's Common was named after Mr. Buss, who lived in the adjacent cottage in the early 19th century. No doubt he reared his cattle on the common. The 1763 Manor map shows Buss's as a small part of Wormley Heath, which extended beyond the parish boundary, shown in red, in the direction of Whitley. The tithe map of 1845 shows 3 small ponds on Buss's Common, 2 in the northeast corner and 1 opposite Buss's cottage, with a 4th pond between the 2 commons. Each was fed by a ditch or ditches running beside ancient boundary banks. When grazing ceased, there was no reason to maintain these ponds, and they were lost to history. That opposite Buss's cottage disappeared in a tangle of fallen trees, but the outlet ditch still flowed in winter and is one of the sources of the River Ock. In 2005, we decided to dig out the ditches and to restore the pond. Here's the pond a few years later. It is possible to detect the site of the pond between the 2 commons in trees shaggy with moss and ferns at the bottom of the steep bank. When I investigated one of the other ponds, hidden behind tall alders, where the ditch crosses the bridleway to the Merry Harriers, I sank to my knees in a quagmire. In the 19th century, young men played cricket on Buss's Common, but by 1960, much of it had become a pine wood. With a ride through the middle for the high-voltage power lines, which were later placed underground. None of these trees had been planted. Seeds spread from the adjacent Buss's firs, a Victorian plantation on former heathland. In the early 1930s, my father remembered Buss's Common as almost entirely heather, with many small pine saplings sprinkled among it. We decided to tackle the trees in stages, beginning in 2007. First, a felling license had to be obtained from a reluctant forestry commission for this deforestation. On this occasion, we decided to yank out the stumps after felling, bulldozing the material into 2 large bunds. The initial reaction of dog walkers and residents of Enton Hall was indignation and horror. Were we trying to reshoot All Quiet on the Western Front? This was in 2007. A machine with giant claws fed the trunks into a grinder, producing a mountain of wood chips, which after a few days began to steam and were later carted off to Slough Power Station. By the following May, the first heather was showing. Within 3 years, it was growing in profusion. Along with innumerable birch, pine, larch and rhododendron seedlings, which had to be pulled up by hand, an endless task. One of the bunds became a favourite. One of the bunds became a favourite play area for children, and later a raised path. Was it a medieval archery butt, I was asked later, or a Neolithic burial mound? The second phase of the felling took place in March 2011. The third, tackling the northeast corner of the site, in 2012. On this occasion, the contractor employed a forest harvester, a Tyrannosaurus rex of a machine, that finished the task in one day. 18 months later, heather was emerging strongly. Heather seed can lie dormant in the soil for decades. Once the shading of trees has been removed and the ground disturbed, heather will spring up. This is seed from heather my father walked through in the 1930s. To enhance the process, I sprinkled bell heather seed, harvested the previous October from Hambledon Common. This photo was taken in the course of clearing operations in February 2012. Here is the same scene 3.5 years later. The fourth and final phase of felling took place in the winter of 2012-13. Thick clumps of rhododendron were tackled at the same time. Rhododendron would never have been tolerated in the past, as it is poisonous to livestock. You can find 3 species of heather at Hambledon: common heather or ling, bell heather, and cross-leaved heath, which has pink bell-like flowers and favour damper spots. Bell heather flowers earlier than ling and is at its peak in July. An occasional flower may still be seen in November. Bell heather flourishes in profusion on the lower slopes of the common, where it has been much photographed in recent years. In addition, there are 3 types of gorse or firs, of which common gorse is much the most vigorous. Its exuberant yellow flowers brighten the heath in winter and spring. Unfortunately, common gorse is prolific of seed, grows rapidly, and will shade out heather after a few years, if not controlled. I have seen heaths lost under impenetrable prickly thickets. The much smaller dwarf gorse, that's the common gorse, dwarf gorse. The much smaller dwarf gorse flowers only in the summer, as does western gorse, an intermediate between the two, and not usually found in Surrey. All 3 native species of snake occur on or near the common. The venomous adder has a fearsome reputation, but is not often seen. I uncovered this one under a pile of cut gorse. A volunteer spotted another in a gully. Grass snakes are larger than adders and are distinguished by a yellow patch near the head. They frequently take to water. Toads are a favourite menu item, but tricky to consume. I have twice seen a grass snake attempting to swallow a toad. This took a very long time. The toad puffed itself up to twice its normal size. Eventually, I fear, it was deflated and engorged. Grass snakes lay their eggs in piles of rotting leaves or compost heaps. This juvenile grass snake hatched in Barry Hughes' garden next to the common. Two sightings of the very rare smooth snake were reported on the common recently. The small, secretive, entirely harmless snake is found only on heathland in a few counties in the south and west of England. It is distinguished by a dark stripe passing through its eye, which, unlike the adder, has a round pupil. Lizards have sensitive faces. Unlike snakes, they are able to blink. All 3 native species are found at Hambledon. This is a common lizard. Slowworms are legless lizards, not snakes. The rare and endangered sand lizard was reintroduced to the common in September 9, 2012. The second photo was taken by Barry Hughes. This would have been unthinkable a few years earlier. The lizards were bred under license by Amphibian and Reptile Conservation. In advance, a rotivator was employed to create areas of loose sand where they could lay their eggs. Sand lizards are larger than common lizards. The mature males have striking green flanks, which are particularly resplendent in the breeding season. The release of a second tranche of lizards a year later was featured on the One show after a visit from a BBC film crew. The experiment was a success. The following spring, a young sand lizard was glimpsed in a gully near the sandpit. The redwing, Britain's smallest thrush, is a winter visitor, migrating from Scandinavia, often flying at night. Philip Underwood writes, "In the autumn they are seen in gardens and fields, where they feed on berries. Then about the first week in November, they gather in a few places for 2 or 3 days, preparing for migration to warmer climates. About 10 years ago, we had such a gathering on Hambledon Common of about 300 birds, and the continual chattering was spectacular. In the following years, we had smaller gatherings." Linnets can be heard on the common. Long-tailed tits favour gorse bushes for their nests. I am visited by this fellow from time to time. Buzzards circle high overhead, sometimes in 2s, 3s or 4s. In late April and May, the cuckoo puts in an appearance. This one settled in an oak tree below which I was working, then flew to a nearby pine. Great spotted woodpeckers chisel out nest holes in dead or rotten trees. Their nestlings make such a perpetual racket, it is surprising that any survive predators. The green woodpecker, or yaffle, feeds on the innumerable ants. Recently, a peregrine was observed perched in an oak tree at the edge of the common. According to Philip Underwood, red kites are slowly taking over from buzzards. Crossbills have been seen at Buss's Common, extracting seeds from pine cones with their specialized beaks. This is a male. If you are lucky, you may encounter the largely nocturnal woodcock. The tiny tree creeper nests in crevices in tree trunks behind loose bark. A Flora of Surrey, published in 1863, has many references to Hambledon Heath. Species such as cross-leaved heath and alder buckthorn can still be found at Hambledon. Others, like round-leaved sundew and oblong-leaved sundew, carnivorous plants bearing sticky droplets on their tentacles, have disappeared, though they survive on other local heaths. Alder buckthorn is a small tree unrelated to alder, but growing in similar damp ground. Its branches and stems are smooth and thornless. The small greeny-white flowers are highly attractive to bees and other insects. The berries change from green to red to black as they ripen. They are relished by birds, in particular thrushes, but are toxic to humans. Alder buckthorn charcoal was prized in the manufacture of gunpowder, another old Surrey industry. Caterpillars of the brimstone butterfly, often the first butterfly to be seen in early spring, flitting about the heath, feed on alder buckthorn leaves. Cross-leaved heath, too, favours damp spots. It's one of the food plants for the larvae of the silver-studded blue butterfly. Another declining species found at Hambledon. The butterfly has a remarkable relationship with the small black ant. The ants carry the butterfly's larvae down into their nest and feed on the honeydew-like liquid they secrete. In return, the ants protect them. The butterflies emerge in June and sip the nectar of bell heather and cross-leaved heath, which are in flower during their flight season. Other butterflies to be seen are the large skipper, holly blue, common blue, small heath, meadow brown, and small copper. A painted lady puts in an occasional appearance. In the autumn, innumerable fungi spring up all over the common. The birch polypore, or razor strop fungus, sprouts from the trunks of old or decaying birch trees. Everyone knows fly agaric, the hallucinogenic magic mushroom. People roam the heath collecting edible mushrooms. They would be wise to steer clear of this one, the death cap. The bay-bodied is good in omelettes or risotto or fried with a little garlic. Flies are attracted to stinkhorns. This is a lawyer's wig or shaggy inkcap. The buttercap was until recently called the greasy tough shank. Puffballs erupt in profusion. Here, sulphur tufts sprout from stumps at Buss's Common. Hare's ear is supposed to have medicinal properties. I saw this pestle puffball near the pond on Buss's Common. This southern bracket fungus was growing from broken beech trunk. These seps on Buss's Common quickly disappeared into someone's carrier bag. This is a zoned rosette, which is parasitic on oak roots. In the past, dyer's maize-gill, the cause of butt rot in conifers, was used for dyeing yarn in shades of yellow, orange or brown. Chicken of the woods or sulphur polypore is said to taste like chicken. This is an elderly specimen. These rare silky rose gills were sprouting from a dead horse chestnut tree near the common. I am grateful to Philip Underwood for supplying many of these photos and the identifications. One of the stranger plants to be found on the common is dodder, a parasite of heather and gorse. It has no roots, taking its sustenance from the host plant, which it entwines and envelops, always anti-clockwise. Its tiny pink flowers emerge in July. It is an annual, but seldom found in the same place 2 years running. It weakens but rarely kills its host. Country names for it include hellweed, devil's guts, witch's hair, and strangleweed. Innumerable little creatures inhabit the heather, gorse and leaf litter. This is the green tiger beetle, a fearsome predator. Over 140 species of bees, wasps and ants have been recorded on the common, more than in the New Forest. Many dig minute burrows in the soft sand or bare ground. There are spider-hunting wasps and wasps that prey on other wasps or bees, stealing into their nests and laying eggs on their larvae. Some bees take care to conceal the entrance to their burrows with a small pebble. Ivy bees, which feed on the nectar of ivy flowers, were unknown in this country before 2001. They emerge in autumn, flying low over the sandy slopes of the common, often in phenomenal numbers. Each excavates an individual burrow to lay its eggs. They are harmless. The males have no sting at all, and the females a tiny one, like a mild nettle sting, which they are reluctant to use. The bees are difficult to photograph because they zoom around so quickly. This is the red-banded sand wasp. The female lugs caterpillars larger than herself down into her nest to feed her grubs, then seals it. Here is the bee wolf, which preys on honeybees. The owner of this funnel web was not at home. Unlike this spider, this alarming spider was also photographed at Hambledon. The heather beetle is bad news. In the winter, it slumbers in the leaf litter below the heather plants, emerging in spring to feed and lay its eggs. The beetles are difficult to spot, with a tendency to drop to the ground when disturbed. The voracious grubs are equally elusive. Both larvae and adults batten on the heather and can inflict terrible damage. At Hambledon, the attacks have been intermittent. Here is Buss's Common in August 2021, and the same area in August last year, when much heather failed to flower at all. By the autumn, however, a fair proportion was showing signs of recovery. 60 years ago, the nightjar, a mysterious bird of the twilight with a haunting, churring call, could be heard over Hambledon Common. Nightjars migrate from Central Africa and favour open heathland for nesting and feeding. Occasionally one is spotted in daytime, roosting along the branches of a tree. Nightjars nest on the ground, making them very vulnerable to predators and out-of-control dogs. Nightjars hawk for moths and beetles, especially at dusk and early dawn. Sometimes they clap their wings. They disappeared from Hambledon Common in the early 1960s. Mary Parker blamed the many Heath fires at the time. Since 1990, both commons have been transformed. Acres of dismal bracken, scrub and pine trees replaced by a much more varied and interesting landscape. Conditions seem promising for the return of this long-lost visitor. But year after year, summer evenings were silent. One afternoon last June, from over the sandpit, I heard a churring call several times. Could that possibly be a nightjar sounding off at 4 in the afternoon? A little research revealed that the birds do sometimes call in the daytime, but very rarely. I returned at 9:30 that evening. As I approached the top of the hill, the churring started. I heard it again the following nights, and at Buses Common, when there was continuous calling for 2 or 3 minutes. Then the churring ceased, and a nightjar flitted silently over my head into the trees. That's it. I don't know if anyone has any questions. That's it. Oh.
Stephen, what is the your end plan for the common? Will you just keep going bit by bit, or?
Well, obviously I can't. I'm hoping that eventually the Surrey Wildlife Trust will take it over. I'm hoping they will, but we'll see.
And what would you hope that they do?
Well, they will maintain it as best they can, but I rather doubt if they'll be able to maintain it like I maintain it. But if there were sort of volunteers in the village who could do things, that would help. Because if nothing's done about them, not grazed or looked after, they will become woodland again. Trees will grow up, brambles will take over. It's what happened to the common before, until we sort of took it in hand about 30 years ago. The heather gradually disappeared on the bracken. It's amazing the amount of bracken 30 years ago. It was really bracken from top to bottom. Extraordinary. Unimaginable now, but that was how it was.
Yeah. Thank you.
It has been reported in Hambledon, but not seen by me. Well, Barry Hughes said he saw one in his garden, and he's right next to the common, and Barry would know.
Stephen, would that be, if the smooth snake has returned, where would it have come from? Because as you say, it's very
Well, it is possible that small numbers were there all the time. It's even possible there were sand lizards there all the time. We don't really know. But the silver-studded blue returned, which was a bit of a surprise, but you know, difficult to explain. But
may I ask, through all this talk, there have been references to a few years down the line, a few years here, 1 or 2 years there. All those years added up have been Stephen's work on the Commons, day after day after day, come hail, rain or shine. And we do thank you, Stephen, very, very much.
if there are no further questions, there's some drink and sandwiches and delicious cake.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you.